The penthouse of the Al-Jazirah horizon, a 60-story glass and steel monolith rising from the center of a volatile Middle Eastern metropolis, was supposed to be the ultimate test of American tactical reach. Inside, a high-value arms dealer, a man whose Rolodex contained the secret logistics chains of every major insurgent cell in the hemisphere, was barricaded behind 60-inch reinforced concrete walls and a private army of ex-Soviet mercenaries. For the U.S. Joint Special Operations Command, this wasn't just a mission. It was a PR event. They wanted to show a force so definitive, so loud, and so undeniably American that it would be burned into the retinas of every insurgent leader in the region. The plan was a textbook example of Hollywood military doctrine. 100 operators from the legendary Delta Force were mobilized. They arrived under the cover of a coordinated citywide power grid failure, a move that threw 3 million civilians into darkness, created immediate chaos, and ensured that every insurgent within a 5-mile radius knew exactly where the Americans were concentrating their focus. The SEALs and Delta operators arrived in a fleet of stealth Black Hawk helicopters, their rotor blades churning the heavy, humid night air with a rhythmic thumping that sounded like the heartbeat of a giant. The strategy was simple, elegant, and dangerously theatrical. A multi-point roof breach. They would rappel down the sides of the skyscraper like spiders, shatter the skylights of the penthouse, and neutralize the threat in a synchronized, high-octane assault. It was the kind of plan that worked perfectly in the simulators back at Fort Bragg, provided your enemy was a stationary cardboard cutout, and not 100 battle-hardened mercenaries with pre-sighted heavy machine guns. As the Blackhawks hovered over the penthouse, the rooftop erupted into a furnace. The mercenaries weren't asleep. They were waiting.
The moment a helicopter's searchlights swept the helipad, they were met by a wall of high-caliber tracer fire. It was a kill zone. The mercenaries had positioned 12.7mm heavy machine guns inside the reinforced ventilation ducts, a tactical blind spot that the American drone reconnaissance team had completely overlooked. The lead Blackhawk took a devastating burst at the tail rotor and was forced to peel away, limping into the dark, while the second bird was pinned in a hover, unable to deploy its ropes without risking a total loss of the aircraft. Within 30 seconds, the perfect raid had devolved into an absolute nightmare. 100 of the most elite soldiers in the U.S. inventory were huddled behind the massive industrial air conditioning units on the rooftop, pressed flat against the gravel, while the mercenaries poured a continuous stream of fire into their positions. The Delta Force operators were trapped. They were high above the city, exposed to the elements, and pinned down by an enemy that had the advantage of cover, elevation, and the home field advantage. The American commanders in the command and control trailer, watching the thermal feeds, were spiraling into a collective nervous breakdown. Their entire tactical philosophy was crumbling. They had counted on shock, on the enemy being stunned by the sudden, overwhelming nature of their arrival. Instead, they had given the enemy the only thing a Merc squadron needs, a fixed target. "Get a drone strike on the roof ventilation," the Delta commander shouted into his comms, his voice tight with the frantic, high-pitched anxiety of a man who realized his Hollywood dream had just become a snuff film. "I don't care if it ruins the objective. Clear the roof." "Negative, Commander," the air support liaison replied, his voice equally strained. "The structural integrity of the skyscraper might fail if we hit the HVAC system with a hellfire."
"If that building comes down, you're looking at 10,000 civilian casualties in the street below. We are in a deadlock." The greatest army in the world was being held hostage by its own tactical vanity. They had brought enough firepower to level the city, but because they were obsessed with the aesthetic of a clean, cinematic roof breach, they had placed themselves in a position where they couldn't fire, couldn't maneuver, and couldn't leave. They were 100 of the most expensive soldiers on Earth, currently being outmaneuvered by a group of mercenaries who knew that all you have to do to defeat the American way is to stay behind a door they aren't willing to kick in. It is a recurring theme in modern warfare. The American command culture treats combat as an engineering project that can be solved with enough gadgets, enough speed, and enough explosive flair. But when the engineering fails, when the enemy refuses to play the role of the predictable victim, the American machine simply stops. It forgets how to fight. It forgets how to improvise. It becomes a heavy, clanking, screaming mess that relies on someone else to come and fix its mistakes. Why is it that the American military, with its infinite budget and its obsession with operator culture, seems so incapable of handling a real urban environment? Why does every mission have to be a loud, destructive, high-visibility event? Is the US Special Operations community becoming so reliant on their toys, their high-speed helicopters, their encrypted links, their satellite feeds, that they've lost the fundamental human ability to solve a problem with nothing but a clear head and a steady hand? Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. Do you think the Hollywood style of American special ops is actually a detriment to their effectiveness in the field? Or is this just the price of being the world's most visible superpower? Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the next 40 minutes of American incompetence are a masterclass in how to burn a reputation.
We are about to see what happens when three men who don't care about the cameras, the helicopters, or the glory of a rooftop breach, decide to take the elevator. The Americans are currently busy losing their minds on the roof, but the British are already walking through the front door, and they are about to make the entire Delta Force look like a group of clueless tourists. Stay tuned. The real mission is just beginning. 40 minutes had passed since the Delta Force choppers had first been shredded by the penthouse roof fire. What was supposed to be a surgical extraction had curdled into a high-stakes, high-visibility catastrophe. The penthouse of the Al-Jazirah horizon wasn't just a fortress, it was a meat grinder. The 100 operators on the roof were pinned down behind heavy-duty, industrial-grade cooling units, the metal shrieking under the impact of the mercenaries' 12.7mm rounds. Every time a Delta operator attempted to pop a smoke grenade to cover a move toward the rooftop stairwell, the mercenaries answered with a deluge of lead that chewed the concrete into fine, grey dust. Inside the US command and control trailer, 3 miles away, the atmosphere had transitioned from professional crisis management to existential panic. General Sterling, a man whose career was built on the premise that America never fails, was watching his own men get systematically dismantled on a high-definition monitor. He had the best surveillance suite in the world, a direct link to the regional satellite hub, and a direct line to the White House. But he was utterly, painfully powerless.
"Commander!"
Sterling screamed into the radio link, his voice tight, veins bulging in his neck. "Use the secondary breach charge on the north stairwell. I don't care about the structural damage. Get down to the 59th floor. We have intelligence assets inside that building who are currently being processed by the hostiles."
If those files leak, the entire regional network is compromised.
"General," the Delta lead's voice came back, strained and punctuated by the roar of nearby automatic fire. "The stairwell is booby-trapped with pressure-sensitive mines. We've sent 2 teams in, and we've lost 3 men to the first 2 landings. We can't clear it. We don't have the time or the space to work through the demolition. We're effectively cut off from the interior." The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The Americans were stuck in a tactical deadlock that defied their entire doctrine. They had planned for every contingency except the one where the enemy actually fought back with discipline and grit. They had planned for a cinematic breach, where they would rappel down, kick in the glass, and be greeted by a terrified, compliant target. They hadn't planned for a meat grinder where their heavy gear,
Their high-tech armor and their reliance on the shock of arrival were used against them to create a bottleneck of death. In his desperate, flailing search for a solution, General Sterling began to weigh the unthinkable. "Get me the EC-130 gunship," he barked at his adjutant. "If we can't get the team in, we neutralize the top 3 floors. I want the 105mm howitzer to target the penthouse interior. If we can't secure the asset, we ensure that nobody else gets him." "General," the adjutant hesitated, his face pale. "That's a civilian heavy skyscraper. You're talking about shelling the top of a 60-story building in the middle of a city. The optics alone would be a global disaster." "I don't care about the optics," Sterling roared, his ego finally overriding his judgment. "We are not losing this asset, and we are not losing face in front of the local forces. If we can't take the penthouse, nobody gets to keep the intel. Do it!" The tragedy was unfolding in real time. The US
military was so bloated, so incapable of adapting to a situation that didn't fit their pre-planned Hollywood script, that they were willing to resort to an act of war crime level destruction just to bury the evidence of their own failure. They were an army that had become too proud to retreat and too clumsy to advance. They were trapped in their own arrogance, watching their elite operators cower behind air conditioners while they contemplated a level of violence that would have incinerated their own objective. This is the central, agonizing truth of the American military-industrial complex. It produces a force that is incredibly good at killing, but increasingly incapable of winning. They have forgotten that war is a game of human psychology and terrain, not just a game of ballistics and budget. They were currently fighting a losing battle against the laws of physics and the layout of a building, and their only answer was to throw more high-explosive force at the problem. Every second that ticked by on the general's clock was a second of humiliation for the entire United States Special Operations community. The mercenaries inside the penthouse were likely laughing, recording the firefight, and preparing to leak it to every news outlet in the world to show the Yankee Giants being held at bay by a group of men in a basement. It was a PR nightmare in the making, and it was entirely of the Americans' own design. They had chosen the most difficult entry point, the loudest approach, and the most predictable path, simply because it looked good on the briefing slide.
Why do we continue to allow a system that prizes the theater of the raid over the reality of the result? Is the modern Delta Force operator becoming a victim of his own command's need for a camera-ready victory? Or is this just the natural end state of a military that believes it can buy competence with a checkbook? Drop a comment below. Do you believe the American reliance on overwhelming force is a mask for a lack of genuine, low-level tactical skill? Is the reliance on the AC-130 and the drone strike proof that we've lost the art of the thinking soldier? Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. This is where the American disaster stops and the British reality begins. Because while General Sterling is currently begging for a gunship to blow up a skyscraper, 3 men in Italian-cut suits are already standing in the elevator lobby on the ground floor. They aren't carrying heavy armor, they aren't wearing helmets, and they aren't here to make a scene. They're here to do the job the Americans are currently busy turning into a funeral. Stay tuned. Back at the Coalition Liaison Center, a sterile, fluorescent-lit nerve center buried deep within the secure zone, the mood was somewhere between a wake and a riot. The massive wall of screens was a mosaic of failure. Live feeds from the Al-Jazirah horizon showed nothing but the flicker of muzzle flashes from the rooftop, the dark, unmoving shapes of pinned-down Delta operators, and the general, agonizing inertia of a mission that had become the laughingstock of the regional intelligence community. General Sterling was practically vibrating with fury. He was currently on an open-channel, secure-link broadcast with a squadron leader in the field.
his voice hoarse from shouting. "I don't give a damn about the perimeter fire. You have 100 men on that roof. You are the tip of the American spear. Either you breach those stairwells, or I will authorize the gunship to put a 105mm round through the front door of that penthouse. We do not lose assets. We do not lose the initiative." Standing a few feet away, sipping a lukewarm cup of tea as if he were waiting for a commuter train, was Captain Arthur "Artie" Penhaligon of the British SAS. He was currently serving as the senior liaison officer, a role he viewed primarily as holding the Americans' hand while they tried not to trip over their own shoelaces. He watched the panic unfolding on the monitors with a look of profound, detached disappointment. He didn't wear a vest.
He didn't wear a tactical radio headset. He wore a crisp, tailored navy blue blazer over a white button-down shirt, and his presence in the room felt jarringly out of place among the sea of digital camo-clad officers who were currently hyperventilating. "General," Penhaligon interrupted, his voice dropping into that calm, flat tone that always seemed to irritate the Americans. "You're shouting at ghosts. The mercenaries have the stairwells completely locked. If you throw another 10 men down those shafts, you're just stacking corpses. You've turned that building into a fortress. It's exactly what you deserve for announcing your arrival with a fleet of helicopters." Sterling spun around, his face a mask of incandescent rage. "And what would you suggest, Captain? You and your 3 liaisons have been drinking tea for the last 40 minutes while my boys are taking fire. You want to offer a critique, or do you have a plan that doesn't involve us losing the asset?" Penhaligon didn't get angry. He didn't feel the need to posture. He simply reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a small metallic key card, a near-perfect replica of the building's VIP access card, courtesy of 3 weeks of meticulous, low-level intelligence work that the US had dismissed as unnecessary. "My team is already in the lobby," Penhaligon said, glancing at his watch. "They're in tailored suits. They're carrying MP7s concealed under the tails of their jackets. They aren't going to rappel onto the roof, General. They're going to take the elevator. Give them 15 minutes. If they aren't out with the target by the time you're finished with your tantrum, you can bomb the building to hell for all I care." The room went silent. A few of the American staff officers actually chuckled. "The elevator?" one of them muttered, shaking his head. "They're going to walk into the lobby of an arms dealer's stronghold in civilian clothes. They'll be shredded before the doors close on the first floor. It's suicide." "It's a joke." "It's not a joke," Penhaligon replied, his eyes finally meeting the general's. "It's called social engineering. Your boys are currently doing the heavy metal dance, which is exactly what the enemy wanted. They're looking for a soldier. They aren't looking for a businessman." Sterling looked at the monitor, the live feed showing the roof, the burning helicopters, the carnage, and then looked back at the calm, infuriatingly cool British captain. The general was a man of the big war school of thought. He believed in mass, in force, and in the overwhelming noise of the machine. He couldn't wrap his head around the idea that the answer to a high-intensity siege wasn't more violence, but less. "If they die," Sterling hissed, "I am not sending a recovery team. I am not authorizing a single asset to go in after 3 Brits in suits." "If they die," Penhaligon said, turning his back on the general to head toward the exit, "you'll have lost the only people in this building who knew what they were doing. Keep the B-52s ready, General. You're going to need them to cover your retreat once we've finished the job." As Penhaligon walked out of the tent, the American officers began a fresh round of mocking whispers. They were convinced they were about to see a tragedy, the arrogant, suicidal vanity of the British Old Guard being wiped out in a marble lobby. They were so confident in their own tactical superiority that they couldn't even fathom a world where a mission could be accomplished without $1 million air insertion. They were trapped in the bunker of their own ego. They believed that war was a spectacle,
that it required the cameras, the helicopters, and the crushing weight of 100 heavily armored operators to be valid. They couldn't understand that the SAS weren't fighting the building. They were simply navigating the floor plan.
While General Sterling was busy contemplating the total destruction of a 60-story skyscraper, the three British operators were standing in the lobby of the Al-Jazirah Horizon, smoothing their ties, checking their cufflinks, and waiting for the VIP lift to descend. They were the most dangerous men in the city, and they were currently being ignored by every security camera, every mercenary, and every trigger-happy lookout in the building, simply because they looked like they belonged. Why is the American military-industrial complex so obsessed with the look of the warrior? And why does it fear the invisible soldier so much? Is it because the invisible soldier proves that you don't need the multi-billion-dollar budget to get the job done? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about the disconnect between the Delta Force theater and the SAS reality. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell, because in the next block, we're going to show you exactly how three men in custom-tailored suits dismantled an army. The Americans are still waiting for the roof to clear, but the target is currently getting into an elevator. You do not want to miss this. Stay tuned. The espresso is being served. The lobby of the Al-Jazirah Horizon was a temple of gold leaf marble, air-conditioned cool, and the aggressive, posturing energy of 100 bored mercenaries. They weren't looking for a threat from the front door, they were looking up. Every gun barrel, every pair of eyes, and every ounce of collective nervous energy in the building was focused on the rooftop, where the Delta Force operators were currently engaged in their noisy, futile, and incredibly predictable siege. The three British operators, Arthur, Miles, and Jay, stepped through the revolving glass doors with the unhurried, proprietary ease of high-level international consultants arriving for a late-night board meeting. They were dressed in charcoal grey, bespoke Italian-cut suits that cost more than a mid-range sedan, their shoes polished to a high mirror shine, their hair groomed with the clinical precision of men who cared about appearances. They didn't look like they were carrying weapons. They didn't look like they were carrying anything heavier than a tablet or a bottle of whiskey. The head of lobby security, a man whose chest was twice the size of his head, glanced at them, his hand hovering near his submachine gun. He recognized the type. Expensive, arrogant, disconnected from the reality of the war zone outside. He waved them through without a second glance. In his mind, these weren't soldiers. They were the kind of people who signed the checks for the people who signed his checks. They were the establishment. They weren't a threat. Elevators restricted to the 59th and 60th floors, the guard grunted, not bothering to look up from his phone. The SBS lead, Arthur, smiled, a warm, genuine, and completely disarming expression. We're aware. The CEO is expecting us. There's been a bit of a delay with the power outage, hasn't there? Terrible business. He slid a genuine, cloned VIP keycard across the marble desk. The guard swiped it, the light turned green, and the elevator doors slid open with a soft, expensive hum. As the three men stepped inside, the doors closed, sealing them off from the chaotic, burning world of the lobby. The transformation inside the lift was instantaneous. The business consultants vanished. In their place were three of the most efficient killers on the planet. From beneath their tailored jackets, they pulled their MP7 submachine guns, compact, devastatingly accurate weapons that utilized armor-piercing rounds capable of turning a mercenary's ballistic vest into a sieve. They didn't move with the clanking, heavy-footed intensity of the Delta operators. They moved with the silent, rhythmic efficiency of a clock's internal gearwork. Zing! The 39th floor. The doors slid open to reveal a security checkpoint guarding the access stairs to the upper levels. There were 5 men standing there, their backs to the elevator, their eyes fixed on the radio chatter coming from the roof. The SAS didn't shout freeze. They didn't scream police. They simply stepped out of the lift, their MP7s leveled at the base of the guards' skulls. Thwip, 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 thwip. The silencers didn't just muffle the shots, they transformed the sound into a series of soft, dry pops, barely louder than a heavy stapler. The guards didn't have time to register the presence of an enemy. They didn't have time to turn around. They didn't even have time to fall. The SAS operators caught them mid-collapse, lowering their bodies to the marble floor with such precise control that not a single piece of equipment hit the ground to make a sound. It was a 10-second clinic in surgical violence. Not a scream, not a shout, not a single wasted bullet. They stepped over the bodies, moved to the primary access panel for the penthouse elevators, and overridden the lock. The American Delta Force was still currently trying to rappel down the side of the building, losing men to sniper fire and screaming for air support, while the British had just bypassed the most secure floor in the city by simply pressing a button. They reached the 60th floor penthouse. The doors opened to reveal the arms dealer, a man who had survived a dozen assassination attempts, sipping champagne and looking out at the city, watching the American helicopters hover in the distance like confused dragonflies. He didn't hear the elevator doors open. He only felt the cold, hard barrel of the MP7 press into the base of his neck. "Good evening," Arthur whispered, his voice as calm as a glass of water. "I believe you're going to be coming with us. Do try to be graceful. It's a long way down, and we'd hate to ruin a perfectly good suit." The arms dealer, realizing that his 100 mercenaries had just been bypassed by 3 guys in suits, didn't even struggle. He understood the game. He had been beaten by the only kind of force he actually respected. The force that didn't need to announce itself. They zip-tied his hands, placed a pair of dark designer sunglasses on his face to hide his identity from any cameras in the hallway, and steered him into the lift. They didn't need to secure the whole building. They didn't need to fight the 100 mercenaries in the halls. They had the target. The mission was already a success. As the elevator began its long, silent descent back to the lobby, Arthur keyed his radio. Not the loud, heavy-duty American one, but a tiny, low-frequency unit hidden in his collar. "Target secured. We're in the lobby, having a bit of an espresso. General, feel free to keep the roof occupied for another 20 minutes. We'd hate to ruin your show." Back on the roof, the American commander was currently calling for a fire mission on the stairwell. He had no idea that the target was currently riding the elevator down to the lobby, sipping the arms dealer's champagne and waiting for the front doors to open. This is the ultimate humiliation of the big war mindset. The Americans were playing a game of capture the flag with 100 players, while the British were playing a game of chess with 3. The SAS didn't need to win the battle. They only needed to win the objective. And they did it without ever once breaking the silence of the room. Is this the final proof that the American military-industrial complex has become a dinosaur, unable to adapt to the speed and subtlety of the modern urban environment? Or are we just witnessing the inevitable end of a doctrine that thinks war can be won by being the loudest person in the room? Drop a comment below. Do you think the Americans will ever look at their Delta Force theater and realize that a suit and an elevator beat a Blackhawk and 100 men every single time? Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned, because the finale of this story, the moment the Americans have to explain why their penthouse is empty, is coming up next. You aren't going to want to miss the look on their faces when they realize they've been outplayed by the businessmen in the lobby. Stay sharp. The lobby of the Al-Jazirah Horizon was a masterclass in controlled, cold-blooded theatre. While the 100 Delta Force operators on the roof were busy screaming into their radios, calling for AC-130 gunships and trading fire with shadows, the 3 British operators stepped out of the VIP elevator and into the lobby with the casual, measured stride of men who had just finished a very productive lunch. Arthur, the lead operator, still had his jacket perfectly buttoned. Miles was adjusting his cufflinks, and Jay was guiding the arms dealer, now looking remarkably docile behind a pair of dark designer glasses, toward the front entrance. The mercenaries guarding the ground floor were still tense, their ears ringing from the distant thunder of the rooftop firefight. They didn't see the danger. They saw 3 well-dressed men, a slightly disheveled VIP, and the familiar, reassuring sight of a business exit. They were so conditioned to look for a tactical assault, for the crash of glass, the roar of flashbangs, and the heavy metallic stomp of combat boots, that they didn't even register the reality of what was happening. They assumed the consultants were simply leaving to avoid the carnage above. As the British trio reached the revolving glass doors, Arthur tapped his earpiece. The transmission was brief, broadcast directly into the command channel that General Sterling was still fruitlessly monitoring. "Target is secured. We're currently enjoying an espresso in the lobby. The penthouse is quite empty, I'm afraid. You're welcome to descend whenever you've finished your pyrotechnic display, General. The lift is clear, and it's remarkably quiet down here. Do try to keep the noise to a minimum. You're disturbing the other guests." In the command and control trailer, 3 miles away, the silence was absolute.
General Sterling stared at the monitor, his face a grotesque mask of shock. He was watching the live feed of his own men on the roof, currently preparing to blow the penthouse door with a massive C4 heavy breaching charge. He watched the Delta lead operator signal for the explosive detonation, his finger hovering over the switch. "Abort! Abort! Abort!" Sterling screamed, his voice cracking. "The asset is gone! I repeat, the asset is gone!" But it was too late. The charge detonated with a thunderous, sky-shaking boom, blowing the reinforced doors of the penthouse into 1,000 shards of steel and concrete. The Delta operators flooded the suite, weapons leveled, screaming for a target that wasn't there. They swarmed the rooms, tearing through the luxury furniture, throwing open closets and kicking in walls, only to find nothing but cold, empty champagne flutes and a view of the city's skyline. They had spent 40 minutes turning a 60-story building into a war zone, and they had captured nothing but dust. Back in the lobby, the SBS team didn't linger. They walked out of the revolving doors and straight into the waiting interior of a nondescript silver sedan that had been parked in the valet lane. As they pulled away from the curb, a column of American armored vehicles roared past them, heading toward the skyscraper at top speed, their lights flashing and their sirens wailing. The British operators watched the Americans race toward the building they had just vacated, their expressions utterly bored. 20 minutes later, the sedan pulled up to the coalition base. The guards at the gate, seeing the familiar markings of the British liaison unit, swung the barrier open. When the car stopped, the SBS operator stepped out, pulled the arms dealer from the back seat, and shoved him toward the bewildered, slack-jawed American military police. General Sterling arrived on the scene seconds later, his uniform pristine, his ego shattered.
He stood in the middle of the staging area, surrounded by 200 of his best men, looking at the arms dealer, a man who had been the most hunted target in the region, now standing in the dirt, zip-tied and shivering. He looked at the 3 British operators who were calmly leaning against their sedan, their jackets slightly wrinkled, their rifles tucked away. "You," Sterling stammered, his voice devoid of his usual command. "You took the elevator?" Arthur Penhaligon didn't even look at him. He checked his watch, sighed, and started to walk toward the British compound. We took the elevator, General. It's a marvelous invention. You really should try it sometime. It saves so much on helicopter fuel and C4. The humiliation was total, and it was permanent. The Pentagon's PR machine spent the next month trying to scrub the Penthouse Raid from the record. They leaked stories about coordinated multi-agency intelligence efforts and integrated tactical planning. They tried to turn a catastrophic failure of the American heavy force doctrine into a victory of coalition cooperation. But the veterans of the Delta Force knew. The mercenaries in the Al-Jazirah horizon knew, and the intelligence community knew. This is the ultimate bitter truth of the modern battlefield. The superpower myth is built on the idea that you can outspend and outloud your opponent. But history is written by the people who know how to win without making a scene. The SAS proved that when you rely on tech, you lose your mind. When you rely on the theater of war, you lose the target. And when you rely on the heavy doctrine, you end up blowing the doors off an empty room while the real professionals are already finishing their coffee downstairs. The US military-industrial complex loves the Hollywood version of the raid, the helicopters, the rappelling, the massive firefights, because that's what sells the budget. That's what keeps the contracts rolling in.
But the real work is done in the dark, in the elevator, and by the men who don't care if the general ever knows their name. If you're tired of the spin, if you want the real story of who's actually winning in the shadows, then hit that subscribe button. We are here to show you that the giant is often the most vulnerable person in the room. Drop a comment below. Do you think the US military will ever admit that a suit and a keycard is more effective than a 100-man helicopter insertion? Or is the theater of war too important to their ego to ever let it go? Hit that bell, stay observant, and never forget, when the big machine starts roaring, someone else is already walking through the front door. We'll see you in the next one, and trust